Did you know that for over 300 years in medieval Europe, the most common way to prove your innocence in court was to pick up a piece of red-hot iron with your bare hands, walk 3 steps, and then wait 3 days to see if God healed your burns? If your wound was clean, you were innocent. If it festered, you were guilty, and the punishment was death or exile. According to documented historical records from 900 to 1215 AD, this was not torture. This was the official legal system of Christian Europe. It was called trial by ordeal, and the story of why people accepted it, how it actually worked, and why it suddenly stopped is stranger than any courtroom drama ever written. Europe, the year 900 AD. The Roman Empire has been gone for over 4 centuries. The sophisticated legal infrastructure that Rome built, its courts, its trained judges, its detailed written law codes, has largely collapsed across the western half of the continent. What has replaced it is a patchwork of local customs, feudal arrangements, and the authority of the Catholic Church, which is the single most powerful and most organized institution in medieval European life. In this world, a serious problem confronts every community that tries to resolve disputes between its members. How do you determine who is telling the truth when there are no forensic tools, no reliable witnesses, no written records, and no trained legal profession? 2 men claim the same piece of land. A woman is accused of adultery. A merchant is accused of stealing from his lord. Someone is accused of murder. In each case, one person is lying. But without the tools of modern investigation, without DNA, without fingerprints, without documentary evidence, how does any court separate the guilty from the innocent? The answer that medieval European legal culture developed, and which operated across most of the continent for over 3 centuries, was elegantly simple in its theology, if brutal in its practice. You did not try to determine guilt through human investigation. You asked God to do it. You put the accused through a physical trial, an ordeal, and you trusted that the divine power that governed the universe would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. The outcome of the ordeal was not a judgment by any human authority. It was a judgment by heaven itself. This was not considered primitive or barbaric by the people who used it. According to the historical analysis of medieval legal historians, including Robert Bartlett, whose 1986 study, Trial by Fire and Water, remains a foundational work on the subject, trial by ordeal was a sophisticated theological system that made complete internal sense within the worldview of medieval Christianity. God was omniscient. God was just. God intervened in human affairs constantly, as the entire framework of Christian theology affirmed. Asking God to declare guilt or innocence through a physical test was, within this framework, simply a logical application of theological principles to a practical legal problem. The hot iron was the most common instrument of this divine judgment, and the ritual surrounding it was anything but casual. The procedure for trial by ordeal by hot iron was not improvised. It was a formal religious and legal ceremony with a carefully prescribed sequence of steps, documented in church records and legal codes from across medieval Europe. According to the historical sources studied by legal historians, the procedure was essentially standardized across different regions, which tells us it was being transmitted through the Church's organizational network rather than developing independently in separate communities. The process began days before the iron was ever heated. The accused person was required to fast, consuming only bread and water for a period of 3 days before the ordeal. This was framed as spiritual purification, cleansing the body and soul before standing before divine judgment. Church attendance was mandatory during this period. The accused participated in religious services, received communion, and was prayed over by priests who prepared their soul for the trial ahead. On the day of the ordeal itself, the ceremony moved to a church or a consecrated space. The iron, typically a bar or a flat piece of metal weighing approximately 1 pound for standard cases and up to 3 pounds for more serious accusations, was placed in a fire and heated until it glowed red. Priests sang liturgical prayers throughout the heating process. The space was treated as sacred. When the iron reached temperature, the accused was brought forward. A priest blessed the iron, blessed the accused, and called on God to make manifest the truth. The accused then picked up the iron with bare hands and walked exactly 3 steps, no more, no fewer. The iron was then put down. The burned hand was immediately wrapped in cloth, sealed with a wax or lead seal bearing the priest's mark, and bound tightly. The accused was then isolated, watched but not permitted to touch the bandaging, for exactly 3 days. At the end of 72 hours, the priest and witnesses gathered for the unwrapping. The bandages were cut in public, and everyone present examined the wound. According to the legal standards documented in historical sources, a wound that was healing cleanly, showing no significant infection, no excessive swelling, no pus, was declared clean, and the accused was pronounced innocent. A wound that had festered, that showed signs of infection or serious inflammation, was declared guilty. The consequences were immediate and severe. To understand why trial by ordeal functioned as a legal system for over 3 centuries, why it was accepted by communities, by courts, and by the accused themselves, you have to understand something about the psychology of medieval European society that is easy to miss from a modern vantage point. The people who submitted to trial by ordeal were not stupid. They were not simply gullible peasants who had no capacity for rational thought. They were human beings operating within a comprehensive and internally consistent worldview, in which the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not where modern secular culture places it. In the medieval Christian cosmology, God did not occasionally intervene in human affairs. God was continuously, actively present in every event, every outcome, every consequence. Nothing happened by chance. Everything was either divinely ordained or divinely permitted. Within this framework, the question of whether God would intervene to protect an innocent person from a burning iron was not a question about whether miracles happen. It was a question about whether God was paying attention. And the medieval answer was that God was always paying attention. An innocent person who picked up the hot iron was not relying on luck. They were relying on a theological certainty that divine justice would not allow an innocent person to be condemned. This belief had a powerful psychological effect on the actual conduct of ordeal cases. According to the historical analysis published by economist Peter Leeson in his 2012 paper on the rational basis of medieval ordeals, the procedure functioned partly as what modern behavioral scientists would call a mechanism for sorting the guilty from the innocent. Not through divine intervention, but through the psychology of belief itself. Here is the mechanism. A person who is genuinely innocent approaches the ordeal with a specific psychological profile. They believe in the system. They believe God will protect them. Their faith is their actual source of confidence. A person who is guilty approaches the ordeal with a completely different profile. They know they are guilty. They know the ordeal is going to expose them. They have every reason to avoid the ordeal through any available means, including confession before the trial begins. According to Leeson's analysis, the historical records of ordeal cases show a remarkably high rate of pre-trial confession and out-of-court settlement, suggesting that many guilty parties chose not to go through the ordeal at all, precisely because their guilt made them unable to approach it with the confidence of the innocent. The Catholic Church's relationship with trial by ordeal is one of the most revealing aspects of the entire institution. Because the Church did not merely tolerate ordeal trials. For most of the period from 900 to 1215 AD, the Church actively administered them. Priests heated the iron. Priests blessed the proceedings. Priests wrapped the wounds. Priests examined the results and declared verdicts. The Church was not a reluctant participant in this system. It was the system's operational backbone. Understanding why requires understanding the position of the Church in medieval European society. The Church was not simply a religious institution in the modern sense, a voluntary organization concerned with spiritual matters. It was the dominant administrative, educational, and legal infrastructure of medieval Europe. Bishops held political authority. Monasteries maintained the only significant libraries and schools. Canon law, the law of the Church, governed enormous domains of life, including marriage, inheritance, and morality. The Church was embedded in every dimension of medieval governance. Trial by ordeal gave the Church something enormously valuable: formal, institutionalized authority over the administration of justice at the local level. Every ordeal required a priest. Every verdict was pronounced in a sacred space under religious supervision. The Church was literally the judge in these proceedings, not through any secular appointment, but through its theological role as the intermediary between humanity and the divine judgment being invoked. There was also a practical dimension that historians have noted. The Church's involvement in ordeal proceedings gave its local representatives, village priests, parish clergy, monastic officials, significant power over their communities. The priest who administered the ordeal, who wrapped the wound, who examined it 3 days later and declared the verdict, held life-altering authority over the people in his parish. This authority reinforced the Church's social position in ways that extended well beyond the specific cases being tried. According to the historical record, the Church also developed over time a set of practices around ordeal administration that, while never officially acknowledged, gave priests considerable practical influence over outcomes. The temperature of the iron, the thickness of the wrapping, the specific herbs or substances applied to the wound before binding. All of these variables affected how the wound would heal over the 3-day period. A priest who wished a particular verdict to emerge had tools available to nudge the biological outcome in that direction. The 72 hours between the burning and the unwrapping were, according to every historical account that describes the experience from any perspective close to the accused, a period of extraordinary psychological intensity. The accused person sat in isolation, permitted food and drink, kept under observation to prevent tampering with the bandages, but cut off from the normal social world of their community, while their body worked on the wound beneath the sealed cloth. For the innocent person, who had approached the iron with genuine confidence in divine protection, these 3 days were a test of faith in the most direct possible sense. Every throb of pain from the burned hand was both a physical reality and a spiritual signal. Was the wound healing? Was God's protection manifesting? The medieval understanding of healing was not the biological process of tissue repair that modern medicine describes. Healing was divine action. A wound that closed cleanly was evidence of heaven's favor.
A wound that festered was evidence of heaven's judgment. For the guilty person who had not managed to avoid the ordeal, these 3 days were something entirely different. They had touched the iron knowing they were guilty. They had felt the burn with the additional psychological weight of knowing that the outcome was supposed to expose them. The wound on their hand was not just a physical injury. It was, in their understanding, the instrument of their exposure. Every sign of infection, every increase in swelling, every appearance of pus was confirmation of what they already knew. Modern medicine provides a relevant lens for understanding the outcomes. The healing of burn wounds depends on multiple factors: the depth of the burn, the cleanliness of the wound and bandaging, the immune status of the patient, the temperature and humidity of the environment, and the presence or absence of secondary infection. Medieval Europe was not a sterile environment. The infections that would contaminate an improperly managed burn wound were omnipresent. A wound that healed cleanly over 3 days under medieval conditions was genuinely unusual, suggesting either that the burn was superficial, that the wound management was unusually careful, or that the specific biological circumstances of that individual were favorable. All of these variables were, to varying degrees, within the influence of the priest who
managed the process. Which brings us to the question that historians have spent considerable energy examining. How much of the ordeal's outcome was genuinely random, and how much was quietly managed? The medical science of burn wound healing was, in the 9th through 13th centuries, entirely absent as a formal discipline. No one in medieval Europe had a germ theory of infection. No one understood the cellular biology of wound repair. No one could explain why some burns healed cleanly and others festered in terms of bacterial colonization, inflammatory response, or immune function. What medieval practitioners had was empirical observation, the accumulated practical knowledge of what seemed to help wounds heal and what seemed to make them worse, embedded in a framework of spiritual explanation that attributed outcomes to divine action. Some of that empirical knowledge was genuinely useful. Medieval wound care included the application of honey, whose antimicrobial properties ancient civilizations had observed for millennia, to wounds before bandaging. It included the use of certain plant-based preparations that modern chemistry has found to contain compounds with real antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory effects. It included keeping wounds covered and relatively protected from contamination. None of this was understood mechanistically, but it worked often enough that the practitioners who used it continued to use it. In the context of trial by ordeal, the priest who applied these preparations to the burn wound before sealing it had, whether or not he understood the mechanism, genuine practical influence over the outcome. A burn wound treated with honey and a clean cloth binding in a relatively protected environment had a meaningfully better chance of healing cleanly over 3 days than a wound left untreated or treated with contaminating substances. The priest's theological role and his practical influence over the biological outcome were inseparable in a way that the system never formally acknowledged. Historian Robert Bartlett's analysis of surviving ordeal records from medieval England, Germany, and France found something striking. The rate of wounds declared clean, resulting in acquittals, was remarkably high by any statistical standard. In some documented case series, acquittal rates exceeded 50%, which is far higher than would be expected if the outcomes were simply random, or if serious burns always became infected. This pattern is consistent with what Leeson and other scholars have argued, that priests were managing the process toward acquittal more often than toward conviction, for reasons that had as much to do with community relations and institutional pragmatism as with justice. The documentary record of specific trial by ordeal cases from medieval Europe is fragmentary, but sufficient to give texture to what the experience looked like for real people in real communities. The cases that have survived in church records, court documents, and chronicle accounts reveal the range of situations in which ordeal was invoked and the human stakes attached to each proceeding. Among the most extensively documented categories of ordeal cases are those involving accusations of theft from noble households. According to records preserved in English legal documents from the 11th and 12th centuries, servants accused of stealing from their lords were regularly subjected to ordeal when other evidence was insufficient. The social dynamics of these cases are particularly revealing. A servant who was innocent had strong incentive to demand ordeal as a way of clearing their name and restoring their position, while a guilty servant might prefer to accept lesser punishment through confession rather than risk the ordeal's verdict. Cases involving accusations of witchcraft and heresy used ordeal with notable frequency in certain periods and regions. The theological logic was especially clean in these cases. If the accused was genuinely in league with demonic powers, those powers could not protect them from divine judgment. A witch who passed the ordeal was declared innocent not simply of the specific accusation, but of the theological category of supernatural corruption that made the accusation meaningful. One of the more unusual documented uses of ordeal involved property disputes between parties of roughly equal social standing, where no clear documentary evidence existed on either side. In these cases, ordeal served partly as a substitute for evidence and partly as a mechanism for forcing resolution. The community accepted the outcome because both parties had agreed to submit to it, and the divine framework of the verdict gave it legitimacy that any purely human judgment might have lacked. The cases involving women accused of sexual misconduct are among the most disturbing in the historical record. According to the documented cases analysed by scholars of medieval women's legal history, women accused of adultery or sexual impropriety were subjected to ordeal in ways that reflected both the theological framework of the system and the specific vulnerabilities of women within medieval legal culture. The ordeal did not discriminate by sex, but the social consequences of a verdict varied dramatically depending on gender. The gap between the official theology of trial by ordeal, a pure appeal to divine judgment uncorrupted by human interference, and the practical reality of how ordeals were administered, was a gap that contemporaries noticed even as the system was operating at its height. Medieval commentators, including some within the Church itself, raised objections to ordeal practice that reveal awareness of the system's vulnerability to manipulation. The most direct form of manipulation was financial. According to historical accounts and the analysis of ordeal records, bribing the priest who administered the ordeal was a known option for anyone with sufficient resources and sufficient motivation to ensure a particular verdict. The mechanisms were straightforward: adjusting the temperature at which the iron was used, varying the thickness and material of the initial bandaging, selecting wound care substances that either promoted or retarded healing, or simply declaring a wound clean when its condition was ambiguous. Ambiguity was the key vulnerability. The standard of clean wound versus festering wound sounds simple, but 3 days after a burn, the biological reality of wound healing is rarely perfectly clean or perfectly infected. Most wounds exist in a spectrum between these poles. The priest who examined the wound at the end of 72 hours had genuine interpretive latitude in many cases. A wound that was slightly swollen but not visibly infected could be declared either way. A wound with minor weeping but no obvious pus could be read in either direction. The theological language of divine judgment concealed what was functionally a human assessment, with all the potential for bias, error, and corruption that human assessments involve. The Church's own theologians and canon lawyers were aware of this problem. Critiques of trial by ordeal appear in the writings of several prominent medieval scholars. The theologian Peter the Chanter, writing in Paris at the end of the 12th century, argued that ordeal was theologically improper because it presumed to test God, to force divine intervention on a human schedule rather than trusting divine justice to operate in its own way and time. This argument, that ordeal constituted an impermissible human attempt to command divine action, would eventually become the formal basis for the Church's abolition of the practice. The critique from secular intellectuals was different, but equally pointed. They focused on the practical irrationality of the system, its inability to reliably separate the guilty from the innocent, its vulnerability to manipulation, its dependence on biological chance rather than genuine evidence of wrongdoing. These critics were not rejecting the theology. They were pointing out that even within a theological framework that accepted divine intervention, ordeal was a poor mechanism for eliciting it. The year 1215 is one of the most consequential years in the history of Western law. Two events in that single year transformed the legal landscape of Europe in ways whose effects are still visible in modern legal systems. One of those events is famous. The other is almost unknown outside specialist scholarship, yet may ultimately have had equal or greater long-term significance. The famous event is Magna Carta, the agreement forced on King John of England by his barons, which for the first time established formal limits on royal authority and guaranteed certain legal rights to the king's subjects. Magna Carta is routinely cited as a foundational document of constitutional government and the rule of law in the world, English-speaking world. The less famous event happened at the Fourth Lateran Council, a major gathering of the Catholic Church's leadership convened in Rome by Pope Innocent III. Among the many decisions made at this council was a ruling that would end trial by ordeal across Europe within a generation. The Pope ordered that clergy were no longer permitted to participate in the blessing, administration, or witnessing of ordeal proceedings. This sounds like a procedural change. Its practical effect was total. Because ordeal required priestly participation to function, the blessing of the iron, the invocation of divine judgment, the sacred framing that gave the proceeding its theological legitimacy, all of these required a priest. Without clerical participation, the ordeal had no claim to divine authority. It was just a man burning his hand, which proved nothing. The reasons behind Innocent III's decision were both theological and practical. The theological argument, that ordeal constituted an impermissible testing of God, had been building for decades. The practical argument was that the system had become so visibly corruptible, so dependent on the integrity of individual priests who could not always be trusted, that it was undermining rather than supporting the Church's authority as an institution of justice. A legal system that could be manipulated for the right price was not advertising the Church's role as an instrument of divine justice. It was advertising its role as a human institution with human failings. The effect of the Council's decision was essentially immediate. Without priestly blessing, communities across Europe could no longer conduct ordeals. And the question that the ordeal had answered, how do you determine guilt without reliable evidence, suddenly had no answer at all. The abolition of trial by ordeal in 1215 created a legal crisis across medieval Europe. For 3 centuries, Ordeal had been the mechanism through which communities resolved cases where evidence was insufficient for human judgment. Without it, courts faced exactly the evidentiary problem that Ordeal had been designed to solve, and they had to find a new answer. The answer they found was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential innovations in the history of human governance. According to legal historians who have studied this transition, the collapse of Ordeal in England specifically accelerated the development of trial by jury, a system in which a group of community members, rather than a divine mechanism, evaluated evidence and reached a verdict through collective human judgment. The jury system was not invented in 1215. It had existed in various forms before, but the removal of Ordeal as an alternative made jury trial the primary mechanism for criminal and civil justice in England, and its subsequent development shaped the entire Anglo-American legal tradition. The shift from ordeal to jury trial was not merely procedural. It represented a fundamental transformation in the philosophy of justice. Ordeal was based on the premise that human beings could not reliably determine truth, and that only divine intervention could separate the guilty from the innocent. Jury trial was based on the opposite premise, that human beings, applying collective judgment to available evidence, were capable of reaching reliable verdicts. This was a shift from divine epistemology to human epistemology, from the belief that truth is revealed by God to the belief that truth is determined by people through reason and evidence. That shift is the foundation of modern legal systems across the Western world. Every legal principle that modern societies consider fundamental, the presumption of innocence, the right to present evidence, the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt, the exclusion of unreliable testimony, descends from the intellectual tradition that replaced ordeal with evidence-based judgment in the centuries following 1215. The question that trial by ordeal was trying to answer has not gone away. How do you determine truth when evidence is incomplete? How do you separate the guilty from the innocent when both are claiming to be innocent? These remain among the hardest problems in any justice system. Modern forensics, DNA evidence, and investigative technique have made them easier to answer in some cases. In others, the problem is exactly as difficult as it was in 1100 AD. The difference is that we no longer ask God to solve it with a piece of hot metal. We ask human beings to do the best they can with what they have. That shift from divine certainty to human fallibility accepted and managed is one of the foundations of the world we live in.